All right, Kyle, it's a couple minutes over before the show. It's not like things are going to get a lot more formal once we officially start here. But how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. As we do this live and as we have this, we're also recording this obviously, but like it's day before the last day of the month for a lot of companies, last day of the quarter for a lot of companies, last day of the year. Um, what's the panic level you see out there this week in terms of ending the year, starting a new year? What's the stressometer?
None. I
None?
feel none. Way more excitement than anything else. This is the first year in the last two where I have people who have been have approved headcount to scale their teams. And that's
Nice.
all. I mean, I engage with sales leaders. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, sure, maybe they're worried a little bit, but what they're talking to me about is their excitement about their ability to grow their teams over the course of 2025, which they've been held back on a little bit in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's great to hear you say that. I see a lot of the same. Where companies that have been told to sort of like hold back a little on spending, hold back on investments, and there's still a dramatic need to be fiscally responsible, right? It's not like
Yes.
budgets are coming flowing back and like, oh, spend whatever you need. But there's an expectation that you're going to grow this year, an expectation you're going to grow responsibly, and an expectation that the market is going to allow for that in a way that it hasn't over the last couple years, maybe, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's exciting. I think yeah, we I would say seeing the same, although we have clients that are sort of, it's any sales team that is not like grinding it out right now, trying to get those extra deals in, obviously still very much happening. But Monday's a new day, Monday's a new quarter, new year. It'll be exciting. So all right, let's get this formally started. Kyle, good morning, good afternoon. How you doing?
Good.
All right, we're going to talk about SKOs today, sales kickoffs, which sometimes aren't even called sales kickoffs anymore. We got revenue kickoff, we got company kickoff, GTM KO, pick your acronym, but we got sort of a commonality around what this is, what it should be, what it too often isn't. So we're going to cover all of that today. In this, I guess we call this a webinar, but like I don't know what we call these anymore because we're not going to do slides. We're not going to just make you listen to just a bunch of boring stuff. We're going to have a conversation around SKOs. For those of you attending, I'm hoping you can be part of that conversation as well. We're going to make this as interactive as we can to get your input. But Kyle, excited to have you here. Maybe for those that don't know you, just introduce yourself and who you are.
Definitely. Kyle Smith, managing partner of the Bridge Group. We are a sales consulting organization, work exclusively with B2B technology companies. And I do a little bit of everything.
So if you're not familiar with Bridge Group, definitely check them out. They produce the BDR metrics report and have done so on a regular basis. What is your Bridge Group's relationship with sort of SKOs? Like and what do those that typically look like?
I would say two ways. One, we are often brought in as an outsider to present, whether that's training, help with change management for strategy or process changes as it relates to SDR, AE, CSM teams. So being there as one of the actual facilitators on stage running sessions. The second way would be working in support of sales leadership and sales enablement leadership to develop the materials that will be rolled out by internal stakeholders. So we do a ton around SKO, top of mind right now. I have four happening in the next 2 weeks within our client and prospect universe. So there's a lot.
Yeah, we're definitely in the midst of the season. Have a bunch that have happened in the last couple of weeks. Feels like the last 2 weeks have had a bunch of CMOs out at their SKOs. The next month is going to be a lot more for a lot of companies that have that February through January fiscal year. And so today we really want to spend some time talking about like how do we reimagine what an SKO is? And I feel like too often we make incremental changes to SKOs based on what's happened in the past, what people expect, what the culture at your company expects, but I want to rethink what they are for a variety of reasons. So before we get into that, I want to make everyone sort of available. I want to enable the chat so that everyone who's attending can see this. We're gonna try to fix that so that we can get everyone to chat here. But want to make it so that if you have questions, you can throw those in the Q&A for now, and want to make this as interactive as we can. Maybe start, Kyle, with what's the problem with SKOs today?
I think It's viewed almost as an obligation. We've done this at every company I've been at, so we need to do it here. We've done this in years past, so we have to do it again. And it feels like something that you have to do, not something that's actually purposefully built and designed to accomplish something. Why are you pulling all of these people together, getting them into the same location, spending a ton of real dollars and opportunity cost in the form of everyone's time to do this? So it just seems like an obligation and a check the box activity that ends up being rushed prep and subpar execution rather than something that's actually having a meaningful impact.
Well, it seems like there's sometimes it's more about hype, right? Like it's a show, it's to get people excited. And there's value in that, right? There's value in getting people together, there's value getting excited for the upcoming year. But anything you do that's purely hype is going to wane before the plane even lands when they get home, right? And
Yeah.
so like that's a lot of money and a lot of time preparing and a lot of people off the phones and away from their families and everything else they could be doing just to do a hype session.
I would say though, even if you wanted to do it on hype, I could get on board with that. So you want to do a hype session, create excitement for the year to come. Maybe you don't do President's Club and you want to provide positive recognition for the year that was. Fine. It's nothing but a hype session. Well, a hype session takes 2 hours. So make it take 2 hours, do a big dinner with everybody and get out of there.
Yeah.
But the second you have a geographically dispersed team, and you're pulling people from all over the country, all over the world in for this event, then all of a sudden that obligation thing ticks in again. And you say, well, if we're going to have everybody here, maybe we could do like 3 days. And you turn, if the goal and what you're trying to accomplish is hype, then just make it, then just do that and accept the fact that that's what you're going to accomplish in that session. You're just forcing a artificial extension just to jam more content in them because you feel like you need to do more with the time.
Well, and so hype sessions are fine, but let's not pretend it's more than just that, and let's call it spade a spade.
Great.
Oftentimes we call this sales kickoff, which often implies the sales team is involved, and sometimes the sales team is the only team involved. What do
Mm-hmm.
you see in terms of the trends of I see company kickoff, I see revenue kickoff, the optimal group in the room, who should be there? And I guess some of that depends on like what you're trying to accomplish, right?
That's the thing. Define your objectives. What are we trying to accomplish? And so when I talk to some of the leaders leading into this webinar, this session, that's exactly what I asked them. And some of the things is like, and I was intentional about how I asked it, is like, what are you trying to accomplish that cannot be done remotely? Because if you can just do it in a Zoom, if you can create hype via Zoom, then why don't you? And so a
Mhm.
couple of the things were improved collaboration across teams. So not the Northeast account executive team who talks to each other 15 times a week anyways, but the EMEA engineering team who actually has a significant input on things that could improve what America's doing on technical config. Fine, great. But if you are going to accomplish more collaboration, then you need to force that into the programming. And so if you want to pull all those people together and start accomplishing things like collaboration, force that into the programming. Some of the other objectives of why the in-person and what they're hoping to accomplish is a shared vision and shared messaging for however the company is branding themselves. Sometimes they purchased another company, sometimes they have a massive update to the product that's going to really change the way that they're positioning themselves, and that is an opportunity to get everyone on the same page really quickly and try to move off of selling same old, same old.
Yeah. I think I see some of the same sort of parallel challenges when people think about President's Club, right? Sort of who
Yes.
gets to celebrate going to President's Club too often is like it's just the sales team. And the sales team's important, obviously,
Yep.
but there's a lot more that goes into that success than just like who was closing the deal. And so I think about kickoff as the same thing. How do we create a shared purpose, a shared vision? How do we create shared responsibility and accountability for the revenue results we're going to go challenge? And so what are some pushbacks that we get from that? Sometimes it's like, well, it's really expensive to have all those people going. Well, this really needs to be something that we focus the sales team on. And why can't we just have something focused on sales versus the entire revenue function? Again, value in that in terms of building and managing and maintaining the sales culture. But if we're going to do a kickoff, to me, it seems like there's even more value in having the broader, unified, integrated revenue teams as part of that.
Yeah. And we see way more, I would say, I see more RKO than SKO at this point. So I think more people are changing the branding and inviting I say inviting like they're the add-ons, but marketing is included, sales is included, sales development, even to some extent, is included, customer success is included, and sales engineering is included. So it is really more of the people who touch the full life cycle from lead through expansion and advocacy. So we see more of that, but again, why are they all in the room together? Because if you bring them all there and then just they all end up in essentially breakout rooms with the team that they came with, that I don't know why you flew them out there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's change management. It's figuring out sort of how do we get from here to there. Um, I know that a lot of companies sort of are even thinking like rethinking, should we have a sales kickoff? Should this be a live or a virtual thing? A lot of companies obviously pivoted to virtual during the pandemic. A lot of companies have stayed virtual to get more people involved. Do you see any hybrid SKOs or revenue kickoffs out there where you have a group of people that have a vested interest in getting together, perhaps like a sales team or sales cohorts? Like maybe you've got a remote selling team and it's actually valuable to have your sellers and your BDRs get together to do some strategy work, but the broader revenue team can be part of like sort of, virtual events. Have you seen any best practices there?
That's probably the one that is set up to be the most successful for the crew of clients that I have. And I wouldn't say that it was necessarily teed up as a hybrid RKO or SKO, but there was virtual prep work done. So we're being extremely intentional about what do we physically want people in a room together to accomplish.
Yeah.
And so for this, it's going to be there is an introduction of a new product, and we did modify the way that the sales process is going to be executed, which has this domino effect across 4 different functions in the sales org. So we're not showing up to the RKO to present and talk about that and say, here's this new thing. Here's all the 15 changes that are going to happen. Thanks for all being sitting here in the same room so I could tell it to one audience. Instead, what we did was we did virtual events for 2 months leading into the RKO to explain what the changes are going to be, what the product is. And then we have some really structured interactive sessions with teams that are going to be cross-pollinated, scheduled for the RKO when they're physically going to be in the same room together. So that would, I think, fall into what you just mentioned, which is like a hybrid RKO. We didn't brand it that way, but virtual prep work to make sure that that in-person time is actually maximized and we're doing stuff that we can't just do on Zoom.
Yeah. I'm desperate to get comments and questions from our audience. We looks like the chat is disabled somehow. We are working on the back end to try to figure that out, how to get that going. I think the Q&A works. So if you have a comment or a question, pivot over to the Q&A and we can reference that and be able to sort of address that here as well. So apologize for that right now. We all live in glass houses. We'll figure this out as we go. So you mentioned you're involved in some SKOs moving forward. Not surprised you guys get deeply involved in those. Can you share, without going into detail of sort of client stuff, can you share some examples of what some of those involvements are? And what are the things you are most excited about components of SKOs for this year?
Yeah. I'll give a couple specific examples. So one was we completely changed the sales methodology. So a company had been using older methodology and they wanted to do a refresh that more closely aligned to their target buyer, target market, sales cycle, et cetera. And so this was going to be a big shift. And they had a super tenured team of AEs in particular, all people who had like grown up in the org, who had been there for a long time. So they were extremely concerned about the change management piece of this whole thing. And so we partnered with their RevOps team in particular to talk about why are you going to change the way that we are executing a discovery call and moving somebody through a sales process for this company. It's not just going to be one call, send a proposal, cross your fingers and hope something happens. And we needed to put some more meaningful gates in and have additional individuals involved in the sales process. So we set up like, this is how the sales process is going to change. Here's who's going to be involved. Here's what's going to be different, and just paint by numbers for here's what was, here's what is, and then really did a sales job, sold them on why this would be better for them as individuals. And then RevOps came on the back end of that to say, here's how that's going to actually play out in Salesforce. So that was one example of one of the things that we did at an RKO, which is roll out a refined sales process or an updated sales process.
So there's rolling that out. So I want to talk a little about rolling things like that and then reinforcement of it. Can you talk about what's working well in terms of interactive content? I feel like a lot of times we pack an agenda and it's a lot of us talking to reps and us talking to the go-to-market team. Are there effective interactive components as well?
100%. Another example. So, what we are seeing work extremely well on the prospecting side of things are plays, or we're calling them plays, which are significantly condensed cadences essentially. So, where you might have this 12, 15, 20 touch cadence built out, we're tightening those up and we're thinking more like six touches across three themes. So, really tight and concentrated message, but focused on a tiny subset of your TAM. So rather than saying I'm going to target a VP of sales at a technology company, I'm saying I'm targeting Series B cybersecurity companies and the VP of sales within them. So it starts to really focus in the messaging. And so we rolled out a play concept at the RKO. And then we broke off and did individual sessions with a mix of, like, if we're at roundtables, we have an SDR, an AE, a CSM. So then we can think about different practical applications of the play based on those individual roles. And then we had them design them. So we would say, so for you, what would be a play? And we gave them these worksheets or frameworks to say, how do we identify the attributes of the subset of accounts? What's the unique challenges that those accounts have to face? What's our unique value specifically tied to those challenges? And then what are some specific customer references for that tiny little subset or that play? And so we actually did play design in the room so that when they walked out of the room at the end of the day, it's not just that they were introduced to a concept of running prospecting plays. They had actual plays roughed out and designed that were pretty close to execution ready.
Yeah. So we're going to use the Q&A as sort of a virtual chat here. So if anyone has sort of questions or comments for this, we'll just use that. Apologize, guys, that the webinar chat is not working the way we wanted it to. I love Rob Ciampa's question here around SKOs. He does virtual sessions, Kyle, at 3 to 6 months afterward to reinforce the content. What are you seeing post SKO to help new ideas, new content stick?
I have to, you have to go to the managers. I would focus, if it were me, if I have, which I do, coming up, a room full of 130 people. And so if you have 130 people at the rep level, driving reinforcement from either an outside party like me, the sales enablement, rev ops team can be extremely difficult, even from a VP level. So I would focus my reinforcement efforts as a facilitator on the managers and get the managers to actually be waving the pom poms about whatever the thing is that we introduced, because they're the ones who's going to interact with the reps 8 to 10 times a week. And I want them constantly feeding whatever we are trying to get the reps to adopt into every conversation they have. And so you could do a check-in 3 to 6 months later, see where the reps are at. Have they actually taken anything you rolled out at SKO and put it into practice? But I would rather do monthlies with the frontline management team to apply way more pressure to how they're embedding whatever was rolled out into every single conversation they have, every coaching session, every pipeline review, whatever it is.
All right, we got a bunch of questions that have come in, so I'm glad we actually sort of moved over to the Q&A, and so I want to be able to address some of these as well. We have our run a show, Kyle. That's sort of what we'll get to some of those, but I want to make sure we address some of this too. Um, Outside speakers, people ask about like bringing people in from the outside. When you do an SKO, usually the CEO or founder wants to speak. They're sort of like, okay, here's what we have other people working on. What are your perspectives on outside speakers? Like from a motivational standpoint, from an operational standpoint, talking about methodology, what have you seen work well from that standpoint?
I'm super biased based off of the nature of how we operate as a business. But our general perspective is that everything that we design for teams needs to be, to some extent, bespoke.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're going to have an outside speaker, it needs to pass the basic sniff test of your good sellers. And they can sense really quickly if somebody's talking about something that has no bearing on what they do. If you bring in somebody who who has a really prolific career and is a dynamic speaker, but works with companies who sell, I don't know, healthcare products only, physical healthcare products, and you are a cybersecurity company, and you can just tell what you're talking about in terms of like all the things that make a sales rep successful doesn't jive with what me and the other 50 top performers in this org have ever done. And now all of a sudden you have people who are, instead of leaning in, taking notes and excited and engaged about what they're bringing to the table, they're more leaning back in their
Yeah.
chairs with arms crossed. So
Yeah.
making sure that if you do bring in an outside speaker, that there is a level of preparation on their part to make sure that the content will actually resonate with your crew based off of target market type of product, at least categorically. Um, Nature of the sales process. If they talk about transactional deals and you do $1 million deals that are 12 months. So there needs to be a really tight correlation between what they're presenting and what your team actually does.
Yeah.
I like the motivational speakers if, again, how do you work in service of your goals? I think about it the same as you think about I don't know, navigating difficult conversations in personal relationships. What are my values? And
Hmm.
do I want to say this thing or do this thing? And is that staying in alignment with my values? What's the goal of the SKO? Is bringing in a motivational speaker, does bringing in a outside motivational speaker work in service of the objectives that you defined previous to scheduling an SKO and saying we're going to spend $2 million on this thing? If the answer
Yeah.
is yes, go spend 80K and go get them. If the
Yeah.
answer is no, leave them off the list.
I got a bunch of questions around sort of additional sort of best practices, but one of my favorites I just saw is like, what are some cautionary tales, Kyle? What are some dumpster fires? Can you share without naming names some like things to always avoid in the future that you've seen not work at SKOs, or any stories of things that people tried at SKOs that failed spectacularly?
Drinking
What's
again
that?
and again, drinking again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
Like if, and it seems silly because these are all adults, but that's the number one cautionary tale that I have seen not once, not twice, not three times, which is overconsumption. Where if SKO ends on a Wednesday, on Friday morning, we have HR meetings scheduled about a disaster or a dumpster fire. When you say dumpster fire, that's what I think about.
Hmm.
People going over the top. That's the worst case scenario. Somewhere on that scale, that's not as bad, but to me, just as egregious is I've had to run the first morning sessions on day 2 or 3 of a 3-day SKO, which means I'm not on day one. So I have the 8 a.m. session on day 2 or 3, and I'm looking at a room full of people who can barely keep their eyes open because they were out until 3 in the morning. And I'm a paid outsider. It's like, why did you pay me to come here
Yeah.
to talk to a room full of zombies?
Yeah.
That's great that you had fun and enjoyed that session, but that to me is like where that those SKOs turned into a dumpster fire.
Can we lean in on that just a little bit? Because I mean, it's like, if you're going to go to President's Club, like President's Club's a celebration. So if
Different.
you want to
It's
like go and
different.
have an open bar, if you just listen, you're still representing the company. Like you still got to
Hmm.
like, there's a level of decorum we expect, no matter what, if you're in a professional situation. SKO is not a party. SKO is a meeting. SKO is a business function. And if you're being sent there, I mean, I kind of feel the same way about trade shows, to be honest. Like if you're
Yeah.
sent there, you represent the company, you have a responsibility. What are your thoughts around having a dry SKO? Like, is there a moderation that you've seen? And I have a strong opinion on this. Can you have moderation, or you just have to be black and white about it?
I think the leaders set the culture, same as everything else in your organization. And
Hmm.
so I think if you have a leadership team who takes this seriously and is extremely intentional about the way that the time is going to be utilized, and not just on that 1 3-day stretch over the course in a year, but over the course of the entire year, operates with a level of high expectations of professionalism that indicates to anyone who works there that that type of behavior is not going to be acceptable, then you can solve it without needing to explicitly state it. If that has not been accomplished, and if you're that worried about it, then the black and white approach, I think, is not a bad idea. And to your point, I think there's other opportunities for that, whether it's club, whether it's the Christmas party or whatever. Like if you want to do a celebration, do a celebration. If you want to
Yeah.
get stuff done, get stuff done. And if you don't have a group that can marry those two things, then you might have to make some hard decisions about just having it be a dry event. I also genuinely believe that if you said on the onset of planning the SKO that it was going to be dry, it'd be a day and a half shorter on average.
Well, and also like depending on where you do it, you might not be able to control that, right? Like if you're doing
Of
SKO, it's like we're
course,
gonna have a dry
yes.
SKO, we're not gonna buy you alcohol, but it's in Vegas, right? Or if it's at a place where you can just like go around the corner at the end of the event and sort of go have a drink. Like to a certain point, like we are adults here. We need to expect a certain level of professionalism, and how you set that up in advance and what you said the expectations are. can drive a significant amount of that. Yeah, I know a lot of CROs and CMOs who spend way too much time on this topic, but we'll move on. I think one of the other questions I also get is like, given the amount of time, given the amount of the money, given the investment SKOs, RKOs include, how do you truly measure whether they were worth it? Is there a dashboard? How do you measure the impact and ROI of doing these after the fact, as well as how to sort of set some expectations up front of what we should be able to see from doing this?
I would do it the same way I do enablement, but again, thinking about like where I focus, which is on upskilling of the sales professionals, and I always pick specific metrics that I want to improve. So in the play example that I shared, where we rolled out this concept and actually had the design of prospecting plays, the number one metric that I was interested in was engagement rates, email
Mhm.
response rates, and quality connect rate. And that's exactly what I wanted to see. So we knew what it was for the 3 years leading into the big announcement at the RKO. And then I also identified what was it 1 month post SKO, 3 and 6 months post SKO to understand how well the plays were taking form and where we saw engagement rates go. But it was super focused. It wasn't on total source pipeline by prospecting efforts that were executed by SDRs or AEs, the two people, primary audiences in that room. I focused on what's the email response rate and what's the cold call connect rate. And then then you can model math to say what's the actual financial implications of that.
Mhm.
But I just pick very specific metrics that aren't revenue generated, like something else that's a leading indicator, and decide and figure out what the impact has been.
Yep.
But you can't do it as a standalone. So if you say, what's the ROI of spending $3 million on an SKO, which one of the ones I'm going to is, um, you can't do that because to me, it's like the idea of wins above replacement. It's like if I did it via Zoom for essentially free, or if I do it with this big hoopla and the physical in-person attendance, what's the difference? That I don't know, which is what you're saying is what's the ROI of the SKO? I can say what's the
Mhm.
ROI of the things presented at SKO, but did they actually have to be there in the physical in-person presence with travel and accommodations, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, what kind of conversations are you involved with as people sort of plan SKOs? If people do start to sort of question them a little bit, right? Like, what did they have? Like, if I've got a salesperson saying, like, here, I want the hype machine, I want to create connectivity amongst my team. I maybe have CMO that says, like, I want to create the expectation that we're going to have an integrated go-to-market motion. This is an opportunity for us to do that. You've got a CFO that says, okay, great, but don't spend a lot of money on this. Like, I mean, so we can talk about the ROI, but let's back that up and talk about the expectations going in. What do you see in terms of people's expectations, and where does some of the friction come based on places where they disagree on those expectations and needs?
I think it's just a weird hang up because if I sit down with any sales or marketing leader that I know of and I talk about, let's just say I gave you $1 million, what would you do with that $1 million to drive improved performance in 2025? I don't think we would get SKL referenced once in the first 25 rows of that list. You would need to go so deep before you would ever actually being intentional, forgetting if you remove everything from your mind, clean slate, where would you spend $1 million of additional funding to improve results? SKO is never coming up. And so I think that's where it gets really tricky because it seems like something that's being forced into um, the course of a year. And I don't know that there's a tangible ROI associated with it. And it seems like a going through the motions thing to me at this point. It can be tricky.
So let's pull that thread. So are you saying that we should just advocate for eliminating SKOs altogether?
If you're not going to be intentional, if the people who are funding it and running it wouldn't put it in that top 25 list, absolutely yes. If you actually have a purpose behind it and you have a really well thought out plan and there's preparation and there's not empty promises, which is another big reason why they sometimes fall flat, where you talk about all the great things that are going to happen and then you don't actually follow through on those. And then reps stay with you. And the next year, when you're talking about the exciting things, they're not as excited because you didn't do them the last time. Then yes, you shouldn't do it. But if you actually have a real intention and purpose behind what you're going to accomplish, great, fund it, but make sure that you're serious about spending $1 million on that SKO because every other budget line item I've ever reviewed with executive teams gets scrutinized pretty heavily and significantly more than this event.
Just thinking out loud about ways to sort of like continue to do it, but sort of make it a little better leverage. Like, could you tie your SKO to your customer or user conference? Could you tie SKO
Yes.
to a big conference in your industry where you're going to have a
Yes.
lot of people there anyway, but just fly them in a
Yes.
day early so that you're going to spend more money, but it's not 2x, it's 1.4x.
Yes. And why does it have to be kickoff?
Right.
What about pulling everyone together says that is a thing that needs to arbitrarily happen in January and February?
Mhm.
Like you said, if let's just say for us, let's just say inbound. HubSpot Inbound Conference is like the event that is our marquee event for the year. We all go to it. We love the sessions. We do a ton of prospecting there. We get a booth, whatever. Well, Inbound has historically been in September. Why couldn't I just do the Bridge Group kickoff or the Bridge Group's in-person, large-scale,
Yeah.
revenue-focused event in September? I love the idea of pairing it with something that you're already going to have a bunch of people on flights into hotels for anyways, so that you can then branch off of that rather than needing to have it as a standalone based off of arbitrary dates.
Yeah, I mean, untying it from the beginning of the fiscal year seems to make that like a bigger opportunity. Like I know a lot of companies that spend a lot of money on SKO, a lot of money on President's Club, and also a lot of money on user conferences. There's at least two of those things that I think you could put together somehow and make them sort of more efficient and just as successful. And maybe even more so than like if you start the fiscal year, like you know what your number is. Like, do you really want to take people out for 3 or 4 days at the beginning of the fiscal year when they should be building momentum, when they should be building their pipeline, when they should be doing prospecting to have a greater likelihood of hitting their number?
And it's an extension of that. You take this long breath out. If your fiscal ties to the calendar year, December 31st comes and the AEs that I know are like, they scatter, they're gone.
Mhm.
Like those first 2 weeks of the year you just finished, it's like
Yeah.
this long exhale of like release before you start building back up. And instead of them like taking a breath back in and getting back at it, the SKO is like an extension of what was already a little break or fall off from the end of the year. So you're right. Then all of a sudden we see a continuous hockey stick effect in performance over the course of not just Q1, but the year, where Q1 can be a lower performing quarter if you don't have seasonality to your business.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Rob has a good question here. Back to sort of talking about sort of content and presentations.
Yeah.
Too often content seems vanilla. It doesn't really stick. Do you have any best practices based on the way you present or based on what you've seen work elsewhere to help content feel more memorable, to help it feel like it sticks in people's minds and actions moving forward?
I cheat. So I usually pre-release. So if
Okay.
I'm going to, so let's say I'm going to roll out some new way to execute discovery calls, I will pick influential individuals within the sales org and do it with them ahead of time. So then not only am I saying, here's how we're going to run discovery calls going forward, I'll say, also, I've been doing this with Matt for a month. And I'm going to pull Matt up on stage, who I know people know and respect and like. And Matt is going to share some specific examples of how we've been doing this and working out the kinks for you and what he's already seen as results. So I will win over the influential potential naysayers also in the room ahead of time, so that when I do the rollout, it's
Hmm.
a lot easier for me. And not only I'm not saying conceptually or theoretically I think this will work. I'm saying this will work. And not only will it work, it has worked in your org with somebody that you know, you sit next to, you talk to all the time, you see on a leaderboard. And so then people tend to be more apt to listen to me, especially as an outsider, when I've cheated essentially and already done it.
Do you have clients that have gotten rid of the SKOs altogether?
Yes.
What have they replaced it with?
Virtual. I shouldn't say altogether.
Okay.
They've gotten rid of the in person. They
Yeah,
do
yeah, yeah.
virtual, or they
Okay.
segment it out. Some of them do regional. So rather than needing to fly people, especially when international is factored in, it gets
Mhm.
really, really expensive and
Yeah.
complicated. But they'll do regional ones. So they'll still pull together multiple teams, but it'll be like everyone we have on the East Coast. Let's say we have an office in Boston and we have one in whatever, Florida. Like,
Hmm.
either go to one or the other, or we're going to meet in North Carolina. They'll just do smaller regional events, or maybe just the Northeast team is going to meet up in Boston. And then they'll do virtual for the ones where more significant travel is included, because then you're talking about a day.
Mhm.
Actually, one day of time not spent being productive in service of your revenue goals, and significantly less expensive from a T&E and venue perspective.
And for those that have made that transition, I'm curious, like, because I can see the push, I can hear the pushback from some companies saying, like, but then we lose the hype session. Like, doing it virtually is something we do every day anyway, so like it's just not the same. I'm sure that those fears, and verbalized or not, have come up with companies that made that transition. Can you share what they have seen or heard as part of that?
The ones that I've worked with who have done that didn't have that fear, but they had really good management teams.
Mhm.
They didn't feel like they had to, everything had to come from the executive or the company level, but they had already let that excitement permeate the organization to the point that when they made an announcement, they had 15 champions who are going to be beating the drum of that message, who drank the Kool-Aid or whatever, that they were really excited about the direction of the company and the things that were being announced, that they had that happen automatically and it didn't need the hoopla of the big event.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's smart. 'Cause I think for the companies that have not done this, you do other things and there's not an expectation of something. When you've done something all this way and you take it away, it can feel like a takeaway. But sometimes when you take something away, like this is a totally unrelated example, but I think it's the context and the situation is a parallel. My very first client, Kyle, like 16 plus years ago, was helping a company do demand gen. I was looking at a lot of their metrics and what was working. And I remember sitting in front of the sales team and saying, like, we are going to cut paid search by 90%. And most of their
Mhm.
leads were coming from paid search. But before they could throw me out the window, I said, like, here's why. Like, I'm looking at the data and saying, like, paid search is doing nothing for you. Like, 90% of what we're buying, you could cold call more effectively than following up with these search leads, right? So I would rather put that money elsewhere. So it felt like a takeaway until I told them, like, I'd rather spend this money on something more effective. It feels like there's a way to do that with SKOs, even with President's Club, maybe to say, like, do you really want us to invest money in this program, or would you like to see us go to these four other trade shows to build pipeline? Or would you like to see us invest in a direct mail program to our top targets? Or would you like to see us increase funding for getting you in the field to meet your prospects face to face? I mean, it just seems like dollar for dollar, instead of a takeaway, you see this as a reinvestment in the success of your team.
Yeah, and if it was all hype, I could manufacture hype for way less money. Let's say you're going to spend 1 million on the SKO. I'm going to say I'm going to give a sliding scale of first, second, and third place 30,000, 20,000, and $10,000 to the people who most effectively or create a presentation that wins based off of stack ranking for um, why our customers and prospects should care about our new feature release. The
Mhm.
thing that we're super excited about. Let's say it's Salesforce Agent Force. Okay. The top three people who create a presentation on their own and record it virtually, upload it to a thing, people vote on it or whatever, are going to get handed 10, 20, $30,000 checks for second, third place. I just spent $60,000 and there will be significant excitement around that new thing. You're forcing attention to the thing that you care about. You're getting people excited and practicing, creating messaging around it. And then you are also adding community where they then need to go in and advocate internally for attention to be paid to the thing that they put their time into. You can
Yeah.
manufacture that. And then the money goes to the employee, not
Yeah.
to the venue, not to the airline, not to the hotel. The money stays in your company and gets handed over to your employees.
Okay, speaking of in your company, Rob has a really good question here. Most of our conversation so far has been slightly insular, meaning we're assuming that the entire audience for SKO is really internal.
Mm-hmm.
What if you sell through the channel? What if you
Oh,
have
yeah.
referral networks? What if you
Yep.
have partners, distributors that could or should be part of this? I don't think it changes how you might think about our SKO as a good or bad investment, but the way you would execute that might be different. How do you think about those models?
I do think it changes it.
Okay.
Because to me, the partner network is just mind share. You're just playing the game of mind share and
Yeah.
you want to be memorable, which is all the things that I personally am not a huge fan of surrounding SKO for your internal team and employees probably works great for capturing mindshare for a partner network of people who need to just be thinking about you when they spot a challenge with a customer instead of thinking about one of 20 other vendors that they could position and sell. And so I think the care, feeding, love, hype works significantly better for capturing mindshare than it does for actually, they just need to think of you. They don't have to do anything differently other than think of you when the problem comes up. And so some of those tackier things actually work for accomplishing that objective.
Does it need to be, I mean, but getting them all aligned around a day and a time and a place to come to your SKO can be hard. What about just going to
Go to
their
them.
SKO?
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
go to them. Yeah,
Yeah.
you could go to them. You could still spend the money and go to them. And when you go to them, it's the same actually when vendors like so sales smart tech vendors will get invited to present at their company's SKO. That's actually
Mhm.
an awesome investment for them. Not only do they
Yeah.
get increased adoption of their products, but in the space that we play in, nobody stays anywhere for a long time anymore. And now they have a more vivid memory of you, of Gong, of Outreach, of who, whatever, of that company when they go to their next job. So you showing up, being a presenter, having your logo in their face, giving them some love, giving away swag, whatever it is, could be pretty impactful rather than them trying to jam them in the room with everybody else at your RKO.
One of my favorite, and again, like this is just trade show stuff at this point, right? One of my favorite thing doing, was working for a company that was like HP was a huge partner of theirs. So they went to the HP kickoff, right? And
Yeah.
there was a vendor partner showcase that people would just put up a booth and say, hey, come by. We ended up getting up at 2 in the morning and doing a door drop. I put hanging things on the doorknobs, and it was some information about the company and then a key. And it said, "Come by booth whatever and see if this key unlocks the box." And it was back when like I think the iPad had just come out, and there was an iPad in there, and it was locked up. It said, "See if your key unlocks the box, the iPad's yours."
Yeah.
And we had a line, right? And it was the whole objective was to get these like senior reps to know more about what we were selling and to think about packaging us with some of the other stuff. So it was just a tactical way of like getting a line, getting some people by, like having that initial conversation, things like that work. You couldn't do that at your own SKO. You had to go to their SKO to do it.
Yeah. No, I love it. I think being more intentional and creative is the number one way to get more from it. I would also say, like in as a general rule, just make it shorter. I don't
Mhm.
know why you need 3 days. I've never seen a 3 day agenda that I think doesn't have a minimum of a half day, probably a full day of fat.
So let's, as we kind of start to wrap up here, and we're planning on the last few minutes to be sort of open Q&A, and I just kind of included that in all of this. And
Great.
if anyone does have any last Q&A questions, feel throw those in the Q&A section. And just thank you to everyone who's sticking around and listening to this. Hopefully this has been valuable. And we're recording this. We'll get some of this content out for afterwards as well. Let's say you're talking to a company that's not doing an SKO today. They're
Mhm.
either a new company or they haven't done one. What would be your advice for them? And I realize I'm asking a very, very big question because I'm going back to like, what are you trying to accomplish? What's some of the guidance you give a company like that?
Can I ask one qualifying question? Are they fully remote?
Let's say yes.
Okay. So if the company is fully remote and they have gone through some significant growth, which almost every company I've worked with has, so it's the easiest for me to think about. So now you have a bunch of new people, a bunch of old people, different ways of thinking, different baggage built in. And maybe you feel that cultural friction is one of the main things that's eating up all your manager's time. They're just constantly playing whack a mole with cultural friction between the new, the old, and the entire org across different functions. Then I don't even know if it needs to be an SKO, but having everybody get together for a physical in person event, we see it. It's cyberbullying. It's really hard if you are standing face to face with somebody to act like a
Hmm.
jerk because you
Hmm.
have to physically look at their face and see the way it affects them in their emotions and their physical reaction to the way that you're treating them. The same is true for in office relationships. It's really easy to send somebody nasty emails and nasty slacks. But now, if you have actually had to sit down across the table for them and talk about how you're going to work together in service of some desired end goal, now, maybe the next 3 months following that, you play nice a little bit more.
Hmm.
So if
Hmm.
you have cultural friction that you feel that in person uh, attendance to some event solves that problem, then great, do it. If you just want to train people on something, I would pressure how much the in-person attendance is actually required to accomplish what you need to.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of sacred cow thinking, I think, around SKO, right? That, this is just something we do, it's something we have to do. It'd be too painful to pull away. I guess the last question here from Rob, and this is a little more tactical, is you seen anybody use AI as a way of sort of enhancing or changing the SKO RKO experience yet?
Training on how to use it, definitely not in the structuring or execution
Yeah.
of the SKO itself, but
Yeah.
training reps on what to actually do with it to make themselves more efficient and effective. Absolutely. We
Yeah.
did a whole session around using the time savings introduced by AI to start building additional business cases for AEs in particular. Don't just do
Interesting.
discovery call, demo, proposal, build a
Yeah.
business case as part of the sales process. We just did that.
Awesome. Kyle, thank you for all your insights today. I know you do this like up and down for a living. So if anyone has any questions for you specifically or wants to learn more about sort of your SKO insights, what you can do, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Kyle Smith is an insanely common name, but Kyle Smith Bridge Group should get you where you need to go. And yeah, reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kyle, for doing this. This has been great. I think we covered some ground I expected and then had some questions that I did not. And I definitely learned something here as well. Thank you to everyone for being part of this. Just really appreciate you being here. Before you leave, I'm gonna put up a poll question. So if you wouldn't mind answering just a quick poll, just around how we did, how you heard about this, whether you thought this was valuable. We want to continue to make these useful. We don't like doing sort of a full just let's talk to you with slides. We like to make this a little more interactive. So we'll figure out the chat thing, but the Q&A worked a little well. So thank you to Rob and others who threw some things in there. Thanks, Kyle, for being a good sport. So we'll leave this survey up here. Thank you so much, everyone, for filling this out. Thank you again, Kyle, for being here. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. If this is the end of calendar, end of fiscal year, best of luck wrapping up. And the good and bad news next week, you're starting at zero. It's the good news and the bad news. We're back to zero. All right, guys. Thanks
All
so
right.
much. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, Matt.